It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. After a turbulent week following last week's D-Day anniversary, can Rishi Sunak find his footing?
There are campaigns that are going so badly, your own ministers are being asked whether you might resign. Has that crossed your mind?
No, of course not.
There are also missteps from the Labour Party.
Was Emily Thornberry wrong to say that your VAT policy would make class sizes in the state sector bigger?
Yes.
There is a war against climate change.
Right, so
unless we tackle this threat, we will be seen as the people who failed.
That was Ed Miliband in 2019, but is climate change a priority at this election? The parties start to release their manifestos. We'll look at what the Liberal Democrats are promising.
Caring has been in the shadows for far too long, and I'm proud that as a party we have brought it into the light.
And as far-right parties make gains in the European elections, what do the results tell us? Joining us today, Transport Minister Anthony Browne, the chair of the Labour Party, Annalise Dodds, author and Professor of Climate Justice Naomi Klein, and columnist for The Telegraph, Tim Stanley. This is Politics Live Election 2024. Let's start with the results of the European Parliament elections. There's been a swing towards far-right parties in Germany, Austria and Italy. And take a look at these headlines. The Guardian, Macron calls snap election after surge of far-right. And this in The Telegraph. Macron trounced in right-wing EU surge. Yes, he takes a big gamble calling these snap parliamentary elections in France after Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party wins double the votes of Macron's centrist alliance. But broadly speaking, starting with you, Tim, what does the success of far-right parties in the European Parliament elections tell us in terms of any shift in European politics?
I think we've got to be nuanced in how we read it. In some countries, the far-right didn't perform quite as well as expected, Holland or Belgium. In other countries, they performed as well as they should do, given their past electoral performance, such as in France. Macron's taken a big gamble, but he might be gambling that actually, if there were a proper parliamentary election, the right wing wouldn't do so well. There are some countries where the right is labelled far-right, and I'm not quite sure it is. In the case of Italy, Giorgia Meloni is now regarded as a stabilising figure within that country and within the continent. And finally, it was overall the centre-right that held.
Well, they held on. That's what
held
Ursula von der Leyen said.
It was the left that performed badly. So the question is perhaps not so much why is the far-right doing so well. Interesting to see them doing well among young voters. I hope we'll come on to that later. But why is it that Greens are losing votes, and why is it traditional social democratic parties, such as in Germany, are just not currying favour with their own populations?
As you say, we'll talk a little bit about the Greens and the loss of support there later in the programme. How did you read it broadly, Naomi?
Well, if we think about these big losses in Germany and in France, I think it does point to a trend where centrist, technocratic governments aren't addressing the underlying crises in their economies, the deep needs and a sense of brokenness of their voters, and that sets the table for the far right. And I think it is really worrying that Macron is so sure he can turn to fear once again, and he's clearly trying to capitalize on this, on what he has successfully capitalized on in the past, this fear of a fascist turn in France. But I'm not so sure it's going to work as well when the lines between the centre-right and the far-right are blurring, particularly on migration.
What did you think when you saw the results coming in to show a swing, certainly? I mean, Tim is right, in Germany, Austria and Italy for those parties, and a loss in support for the Greens?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as someone who's on the progressive side of politics, I was very concerned to see that rise in extremist support, unfortunately. I do think there were a range of different factors at play here. You particularly often saw incumbent parties that were represented in government, really being hammered during these elections. But I think in terms of Macron's choice, obviously it's a gamble, but we saw Pedro Sanchez, of course, a socialist leader in Spain, taking that gamble after regional elections, and arguably that gamble paying off for him. So we'll have to see what happens.
Anthony?
Well, I used to be a journalist Europe correspondent for the Times, covering European elections, and one of the things I learned then is the elections are different in every single country, often on completely different issues. I mean, there are some trends, but you can read too much into it. Clearly, it's concerning that the far right has gained ground in various countries, but I think the lesson that I think needs to be learned is really important for mainstream politicians to listen to the concerns of their voters, and I think the main issue here is over high levels of immigration, or certainly illegal immigration, and that's why I think it's really important for mainstream parties to embrace that. And we're certainly, as the government, we've introduced a really tough package of measures there, really to listen to voters' concerns.
Well, let's talk about the election here, because Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is back facing journalists after a torrid time by cutting short, of course, his stay at the commemorations in France last week. We can see him here out campaigning. Is it time, Anthony, for other cabinet ministers to step forward and for him to step back from being front and centre of the campaign?
Well, other cabinet ministers are out campaigning the whole time and doing interviews the whole time. We're all campaigning. I'm a minister, not a cabinet minister.
But my question was, should Rishi Sunak step back from being front and centre? Because it has been something of a presidential-style campaign for him. But is he a hindrance now?
Not at all, no. I mean, he's a very capable leader, and all election campaigns have their ups and downs on all sides.
This was more than an up or down.
Parties. But no, it's been. I think the campaign generally, as you'll point to some of the downs, I'll point to some of the ups. We've had a lot of great policy announcements that have come out. We've got the Manifesto tomorrow, which I'm very much looking forward to. Some of the announcements have really caught public imagination, and overall, I think it's been a very energetic campaign, and absolutely he should be front and centre. But we are all campaigning. Cabinet ministers, junior ministers, backbench MPs, we're all out there campaigning the whole time.
What have you made of the start of the week for Rishi Sunak after what happened at the end of it in terms of morale in the Conservative Party?
I can imagine someone saying to Mary Todd Lincoln, "What did you think of the performance?" and her replying, "Well, it had its ups and downs." Sometimes Rishi Sunak looks to me as though he's on the verge of tears. If you listen to him with the sound off, his eyes are kind of red and he has that desperate pleading, "stay with me" kind of look on his face. And I think part of the problem is that his team are supremely confident in his ability. They have been for many years since he was Chancellor. In the race against Liz Truss, they just couldn't accept that Liz Truss won that campaign. And then when they got him in there, they thought he's the smartest guy. He's going to just blow the public away. And then it turns out he's not that good, that he actually looks a bit too well oiled, a bit too well programmed, and that sometimes in politics, choices are an art rather than a science. And in the case of the D-Day event, whatever his schedule had been, the political artist would have looked at that and said, you know what, this is an international event. And just like Margaret Thatcher refused to leave Paris in the middle of her leadership campaign, he should have said the British public will want to see me here. He lacks that artistic touch when it comes to politics. Yes, there are other people they could bring out, but at this stage, aside from an endorsement by His Majesty the King, there is almost nothing that could rescue the Conservative Party, and most MPs and ministers, including in very safe seats, would rather be campaigning on the doorstep to try to retain their majority than wasting time trying to save the Conservative brand.
Anthony?
Well, I know what the national polls are, and clearly I want them to narrow, and I'm absolutely working for a Conservative victory. And but we are all out campaigning. We're doing everything we can. We've got the national messages that are out in the Manifesto and the other policy announcements, and we're all knocking very hard on doorsteps. And the question, if you believe the polls, the question then is how big is the Labour majority, and do you want to hand a blank cheque to the Labour Party? The bigger the majority, the more
And those are the lines.
Be hostage to the left wing of the party.
Those are the lines, clearly. But what has it come to, Anthony Brown, when interviewers are questioning whether or not the Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister is actually going to still be in that position of leading the party into the election in the middle of a campaign? I mean, it's extraordinary.
Look, journalists are obviously free to ask whatever questions they want, and they do. But it's clearly completely bonkers to expect the Prime Minister to resign 2 weeks before an election. I mean, that's obviously such a ridiculous thing to think about or even question.
Well, except the Work and Pensions Secretary Mel Stride engaged with the question and answered it as if it was a realistic proposition.
Look, it's not. Look, I was a journalist 20 years. You have these little fads and things, and you ask a whole load of questions. You think it's interesting. You get the ball, you run with it for a while, and then you go off and you chase the ball somewhere else. And it's like it's clearly absolutely not going to happen. It's completely a ridiculous thing to even suggest. And journalists are free to ask what questions they like.
If you look at some polls, we are contemplating the possibility that on July the 4th, the Conservative Party has fewer seats than the Lib Dems and fewer votes overall than Reform. That's extraordinary. And part of the problem is that whenever the Tories say, yes, but are you willing to take a gamble on a Labour government? Well, A, I personally don't believe Keir Starmer's a socialist. I just don't think he's going to do what you guys are saying he's going to do. I don't think it's in his character. And B, everything that you keep saying Labour might do, you have done to historic degrees, including on tax and immigration. This is the problem, is that the brand is just kind of, it's gone. It's gone. No one likes the Conservative Party anymore.
Well, look, the Conservative Party has been the biggest election-winning machine since the Second World War. The only poll that matters
is that what you're holding on to?
No, just that this country is generally a conservative, the small c country. They support conservative values.
Yes, and the Labour Party is a small c conservative party.
The only poll that matters.
They're stealing your policy. They're running to the right on those issues.
The only poll that matters is the one on election day, obviously. And we're all old enough to remember lots of election upsets, and so polls, even a few weeks beforehand, can be massively.
You think the Conservatives will win this election?
Look, I know what the national polls say. I just say it's not entirely impossible, but I know what the national polls say. But the Labour Party historically it's only been able to win elections by pretending to be a Conservative party, by adopting traditional conservative values, because we are a conservative.
That is true.
You can either have real conservatives or fake conservatives.
The small c, well, maybe they are real conservatives now. I mean, is that how you describe yourself? Small c conservative parties. 1997, you adopted conservative spending plans, certainly Tony Blair and Gordon Brown did. And this time, you're doing exactly the same thing, ruling out any increases in tax. You are the same.
Completely the opposite. Anyone who looks at what Keir Starmer set out in terms of our first steps, in terms of our missions, would never be under that impression. And, Anthony said something that I think was very... Sorry, you spoke for a long time. I'd like to say something now, if I may.
Yeah, go on.
Anthony said that the Conservative Party was an election-winning machine. He kept talking about how it was always wanting to win in politics. What the Labour Party is interested in is what we can do to change our country. And those Labour governments, when we've had them, they delivered, for example, the NHS. They delivered economic growth. They delivered a national minimum wage. They delivered a country that was moving forward in terms of people's living standards, not backwards. That's what matters to us, what we can improve in the country. And, what's happened with this election campaign has just been a reflection of the last few years of Conservative government. It's been shambolic. Yes, that's what we've seen under the Conservatives for 14 years. We've not seen that.
All right, well, let Anthony respond and then...
Every single Labour government has left office with higher unemployment than it's had when it arrived in office. And the last Labour government inherited an absolutely golden economic scenario, and you left the country, in your own words, run out of money.
The economy was growing when Labour left office. On average, growth rates were far higher under the 97 to 2010 government than they have been under Conservative
That's true across the whole world.
All right, well, Anthony, just one question. What will living standards be when we go into this election in a few weeks' time? Higher or lower than they were 14 years ago?
Wages have risen higher than inflation for the 10 last months. The first quarter of this year...
10 last months? Right, OK.
We had the fastest growing economy in the G7 this year, in the first quarter of this year.
Naomi, just stepping back and as an observer of the campaign so far, what have you made of it?
I think that the Tories know they're going to lose, and they seem to be practically throwing the election. They've basically written it off. And it seems like Labour is trying not to make any sudden movements and to send lots of reassuring messages that very little really is going to change. And I think if we look at the European elections...
Are you disappointed by that?
I am. I'm not just disappointed. I'm worried, because if we look at what just happened in Europe, if we look at what Schulz is doing, I'm seeing Labour poised to make the same mistakes, which absolutely I think will win an election, but will set the table for a far-right comeback. That's what I'm worried about. I think the message that we're seeing from Europe is there really need to be policies that meet people's most urgent needs. And this idea of what we're hearing from your leader about these fiscal rules and basically sounding like Margaret Thatcher on running a government like a household, which is ridiculous, is going to set the table for a far-right comeback. And this sort of footsie with reform that we've been hearing from our friend over here.
Naomi, I would very humbly suggest that delivering...
I just got here. What do I know?
Sure, but delivering, for example, 40,000 more appointments in our NHS every week, that is responding to people's real needs, because there are currently almost 8 million on NHS waiting lists in the UK. That is gripping onto a huge issue, making sure we have that new deal for working people, to improve people's living standards, having an industrial strategy for our country, decarbonising our energy supply.
And delivery will be key.
To do that.
Delivery will be key. But can I come back to the campaign, talking of assets? I mean, in the debate, in terms of accuracy in what is being promised or disputed by Labour, Keir Starmer took about 20 minutes when I was watching the debate to challenge Rishi Sunak's claim that Labour wanted to increase tax by £2,000. Now, you don't need to go into the claim. We had all of that last week. But it took him 20 minutes to get there. He, like Rishi Sunak, does he also lack a bit of nimbleness when it comes to politics?
Well, to be fair, he kept being told by the presenter that the issue of tax was going to be come back to continuously. No, I think...
What, so he's too polite? Well. He's too polite, is that what you're saying?
He was told it was going to be come back to, but to be...
He seemed not to know, actually, while I was watching, but anyway...
But Keir has been totally clear, as has Rachel Reeves, as has all of the Labour Party, that we will not be raising income tax, VAT or national insurance. We've made that clear. The Conservatives are trying to throw mud around, including with the claim that was made during that debate. I think Rishi Sunak has run out of options. He can't run on his party's record because the record is so bad over the last 14 years. He can't run on its plans for office because they don't have a plan for our economy and our public services and our security. That's why he's trying to make up this nonsense.
But how reassuring is it when we also had the Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, sitting where you are last week? She's hardly proving to be an asset either in terms of the campaign. She keeps getting the policies wrong. I asked her for more detail on Politics Live last week about how Labour will pay for the extra appointments, scans and operations at weekends that you are promising. Let's have a listen.
We're going to be paying for it by making sure that we close more of the loopholes. And we have, I think it's 5.5 as a result of that, and that we're going to be able to use.
5.5 what?
It's 5.5 million that we're going to...
Pounds, OK.
I'm not sure. But anyway, but that's how we're doing it.
Actually, says the extra appointments and scanners will cost £1.3 billion.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
All right.
And I knew I had it wrong, so I just like...
Well, figures are important, as we've discovered from the debate last night. I mean, over the weekend, she's also said that class sizes in state schools, some of them, will get bigger, about which she's intensely relaxed, as a result of your policy to put VAT on private schools. So exactly what sort of an asset is Emily Thornberry?
Well, look, Emily got that wrong about class sizes. She got that wrong as well about the revenue. I have to say, very unusually, she's a very clever woman. It's very unusual that she would get things wrong. And actually, to be fair, she's someone who, as soon as she makes a mistake, she accepts that and she's very upfront about that. I wish we had that kind of honesty, frankly, coming from, I'm sorry to say, the Conservatives, when they've repeatedly used a figure that Treasury civil servants themselves say should not be used, and yet they're still bandying it about.
I personally prefer politicians who don't make mistakes. It's always a classic thing with politicians is whenever they do something horrendously wrong and they immediately apologise for it, they try and get brownie points for having then immediately apologised for it. I just wish people in public life made less mistakes and that they were less catastrophic. But I do think that, to go back to the point about Labour and where it stands politically, Labour finds itself in an odd position because it is going to win, but at a time in which the public has probably, if anything, moved a bit more rightwards on some issues than it was 14 years ago, on issues like immigration, as we've seen in the European election. And so Labour is slightly bucking the trend. The continent is politically moving to the right. Britain is about to elect a left-wing government, and so its room for manoeuvre is going to be very limited. But it's benefiting from the errors of the Tory party. It's benefiting from the economic conditions of lockdown and things like that. But I have to come back to this point about the Conservatives being a post-war election-winning machine. They were an election-winning machine because they delivered for their voters. After the 1950s government, after the 1980s government, the middle class could say their life had got better in some way. Macmillan, etc., got rid of rationing. Thatcher sold off the council houses. After 14 years, there is no concrete way in which my life has got better under a Conservative government.
We all know this. From 2010, inherited a country that in Labour's own
that
had
really
run out of
is
money.
history now.
Maggie inherited the winter of discontent.
We had the pandemic. We had the global energy crisis. The inflation up to 11%. Inflation reaching that level makes everyone poor. It's been a hurricane followed by a landslide followed by lightning. I mean, it's been really torrid, not just in the UK, but in most other Western countries. had really, really difficult times.
And
actually, our economic growth in the UK has been higher than every other major European country since 2010. Faster than Germany, faster than France,
economic
faster than Italy,
growth has
faster than
been
Spain.
weak since 2010.
It's been weak across.
But let's not make out it's been sort of going great guns.
This is really important. It's been weak across the developed world and all the other countries, and that's part of the reason you're seeing the results in the European
Well, let's
elections.
pick up the.
But actually, we have grown faster than Germany, faster than France, faster than Italy, faster than Spain since 2010.
But maybe
since 2016,
it's Tim's point that he is not feeling the benefits of it.
Better economic growth than other comparable countries.
And is this the headline in the Times? Tories must embrace Farage, says Braverman, former Home Secretary Suella Braverman, saying that the now leader of reform is somebody that should be embraced. Would you like to embrace Nigel Farage?
No. No, he's a very divisive figure. He's a very divisive figure. He's leader of another party which doesn't represent my values. That actually wants to, in his own words, wants to destroy the Conservative Party. He's a very divisive figure. I don't think we should embrace him.
Right. What do you say to Suella Braverman encouraging it?
She's a backbench MP. She can say what she likes.
Right. Well, you can see in the corner of our screen then pictures of Nigel Farage and Richard Tice from Reform. They're launching their economic policy today. But you have also written in The Telegraph, Tim, about whether philosophical Conservatives should vote Reform. We can show you the headline in just a minute. There it is. Labour will form the next government. Right of centre voters must now decide what kind of opposition they want. What are you saying exactly?
My headline 3 weeks ago was, should I vote Conservative? Because back then the issue was who forms the next government. My point is that with the campaign going so badly for the Tories, many philosophical Conservatives like me, small c Conservatives, not party animals, will be thinking, who do I want the opposition to be? And some may well calculate that they would either prefer Reform or they can see Reform overtaking the Tories, so they want to jump on that particular bus. Now, I weigh up the strengths and minuses of that. One serious minus with Reform, and I suspect it's going to become more apparent, is that a party defined by the sovereignty issue attracts very, very right-wing and unpleasant people. And already some have been identified over the weekend. Racist candidates have been said. This is going to be an issue for Reform it's going to have to deal with. Another problem is it's a one-man band. It's very much Nigel Farage's party that you'll be voting for. Nonetheless, if you are philosophically Conservative, if for all the reasons we've just discussed you're just sick of the Conservatives and you can see Reform taking over, possibly entering Parliament with a handful of seats, that dramatically changes the realms of possibility. And I think, as Suella Braverman has said, whether you like it or not, the centre-right and the right are going to have to kiss and make up in the next 5 years. And there's either going to have to be a reconciliation, an alliance, or the emergence of a hybrid party. Because so long as the British right is split like this, it will never win another election.
How worried are you?
Well, clearly, Reform is a challenge in certain Conservative seats, but we all know that a vote for Reform, a vote for Nigel Farage, is effectively a vote for Keir Starmer, and it will give him a blank check when he gets into, when he wins the election, and he'll be more beholden more to the left in the party, more following his natural instincts, which, unlike Tony Blair, who was a centrist from the start, Keir Starmer has been historically from the left of the party on things like immigration we were talking about earlier. He said recently that reducing immigration will be an act of economic vandalism. We know the instincts of the Labour Party are to raise taxes whenever they can, except when they get close to an election, they think they might win, and they then suddenly decide they don't like high taxes. But in Parliament over the last 5 years, they would spend all the debates I've been in on tax. Labour have been calling for higher taxes.
That's simply untrue. Labour's consistently said
that we
want taxes.
We would like lower taxes. We've just had all the economic because we spent £500 billion helping out families and businesses during the pandemic and during the cost of living crisis.
We've got the highest tax burden we've had in history.
Yeah, because we spent £500 billion supporting.
But we've got the highest. So whichever way you look at it, that is the reality. And those, by the way, those frozen tax thresholds will exist still until 2028, if Labour wins the next election. But let's not be dishonest about the tax burden that people are facing.
I'm not being dishonest about it. I'm just explaining the context.
Right. All right.
Because we gave such extraordinary support to families and businesses during the pandemic and the cost of living crisis, and that does have to be paid for.
Right.
But if you think that it would be lower under a Labour government had they been in power, had Jeremy Corbyn won in 2019.
Well, they pledged not to raise the headline levels of tax. It's whether you believe them.
We all know what your instincts are on tax. You want high taxes.
So you can try
except when you get close to elections.
Magic up ideas out of nothing, Anthony. But the reality is, if we had the same level of economic growth under the last 14 years...
Hang on,
Anthony,
stop interrupting her. Let her finish what she wants to say.
Okay, well, you can let me know whether this is true or false. If we'd had the same level of economic growth from 2010 until today as what we had under the Labour governments from 97 to 2010. Is it true or is it not true that we would have had billions of pounds more to spend on public services?
It's completely ignoring the fact we've had a pandemic, we've had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and everything else. The last Labour government had none of that. You had a completely golden economic scenario, and you still went bankrupt.
Hang on, Annalise. The question is,
I've always such a strongly growing economy and running out of money.
Anthony, you've said your piece. I've already spoken about the tax thresholds being frozen, and that's why we have high levels of tax. There is nothing, though, and we've heard it from independent experts, that says that ruling out any increases in the headline rates of tax or the headline taxes at all means you are going to have to make, if you win the election, some pretty eye-wateringly difficult choices on spending cuts. Because the sums don't add up. Growth fairy or not. Growth may come, it won't come for a few years to the levels that you will either have to borrow more money or you will have to cut spending in those unprotected departments. And that is also being dishonest by saying you won't.
No, actually, what the IFS have said...
That is what the IFS have said.
The right to say this is that growth will not come from nowhere, that growth will not come without a plan. And they're absolutely right. Continuing, as we've seen over the last few years, is not going to work. That's why Labour set out an industrial strategy.
But they don't know if that growth is going to come.
A green prosperity plan. But you have to have a plan. Without a plan, you're not going to...
All right. I think, Naomi, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to back up a little bit because I am concerned, and coming back to the European elections, with this normalisation of the far right in this country and this idea that, you're just voting for the opposition. I think this is a dangerous party. If we look at Farage's alliance with Trump and Trump's open warfare with democracy, his statements that he's going to be a dictator on day one, I don't think that it is something casual to just say, oh, well, maybe they'll make a better opposition. Since I've been here, this country has been in the grips of a scandal about Rishi Sunak's actions around D-Day, and I understand why people are offended. I understand the pain that this is evoked, but to me, the lessons of the Second World War, the lessons of D-Day, the way to honor the many, many victims is to look at history and look at the conditions under which the far right rises. And I think it's when the right makes an alliance of convenience with the far right. That is when fascism rises.
All right. Well, let me just show you the details of the first leader interview here with Rishi Sunak. Nick Robinson will be interviewing him as part of the Panorama interviews tonight at 8 o'clock on BBC One and the iPlayer. I said we'd return to the Green policies and the results of the elections in the European Parliament. The Guardian: Green Party losses in EU elections raise concerns over Green Deal. Now, the Green Deal are commitments and pledges made by the European Commission with targets. Now there is risk and concern that they might water those down, according to supporters of it. Green Party's lost seats in Germany, Austria and France from 72 seats they were holding down to 52. Why did they lose so many seats in the elections, Naomi?
Well, I mean, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, I do think that it's different in different countries. But if we're talking about Germany, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that it's the governing alliance. And this is a party that really hasn't delivered on some core green pledges. We've seen climate activists enraged over doubling down on the dirtiest coal on the continent. And also, something that we haven't talked about is the fact that people are really, really deeply, progressive voters are enraged by betrayals over Gaza, specifically from the German Greens. So there's a great deal of demoralization from their natural base as they have aligned themselves with Israel's war crimes. and betrayed many of their climate policies. So I think it is absolutely the wrong conclusion to draw that no green policy can win an election. I think these very weak sort of technocratic green policies clearly aren't going to carry the day.
Well, and it's interesting that young voters, many of them, actually voted in Germany for the Alternative for Deutschland party, which is on the far right of politics. Was that surprising to you that younger voters, 18 to 25-year-olds, were attracted by some of these right-wing parties?
Not in the slightest. And if we are talking about history, I'm not necessarily saying the AfD is the Nazi party, but if you go back in history, in the 1930s, a base of support for the Nazi party was the universities and students. So the thing about young people, I can't remember who said it, so I'm sorry if I'm stealing someone's very good idea here, but the thing about young people is they're not psychologically left or right-wing, they're radical. They're people who are more open to new ideas. They're people who've got less to lose. They're people who look at a broken order and say, please fix this. And so it's possible to attract them one way or t'other. On the green issue, part of the problem is that for a very long time we have been told that going green creates jobs. It creates growth. It can do, of course it does. But in any kind of industrial revolution, there are losers as well as winners. And part of the problem with going green is it affects farming communities, and secondly, it can affect consumers. In this country, we have pretty much stuck with our targets, and we've done a very good job in reducing carbon. The Tories and Labour can both be quite proud of that, actually. But we're now reaching that point where, in order to go further, we have to start to ask people to make real sacrifices, such as buying electric cars, buying new heaters for their homes, etc., etc. Those are the stuff which is going to hit people. And you're going to have to explain to people, when China and India are producing so much carbon, you've now got to explain to the publics of West Europe who produce considerably less why they should make personal sacrifices when the dictatorship in China, for instance, will not. Right.
Well, is that the conclusion that Labour's come to? That's why you diluted your £28 billion commitment to climate change policies, because it's unaffordable and they're not appealing.
Well, actually, that was following Liz Truss crashing the UK economy, which clearly hit family finances, but it hit the public finances as well. But we're absolutely clear that we need to deliver for the climate, yes, but we have to do it in a way that gets people's bills down, that delivers energy security, and that's creating the new jobs that are going to be so critical for our country. And actually, the evidence, I'm afraid, is contrary to what was just set out a moment ago. If you look at the UK's energy mix, currently at the moment, our prices are pegged to that of fossil fuel in other countries. In the UK, we've seen households paying on average more. So, for example, first half of 2023, households were paying much more for their energy than, I think it's 25 out of the 27 EU countries. We've seen them going up faster in our country. And the evidence shows that when you have more renewables, actually the costs go down. Now, I agree, if this isn't part of a properly planned transition, if it doesn't have an industrial strategy, a skills strategy, if it doesn't have a strategy to ensure those jobs pay, that you're supporting those communities, like the northeast of Scotland, then yes, people will lose out. But that's why Labour's not taking that road. Green parties would take us down that road. They wouldn't deliver on social justice. That's not at the core of them, but it is at the core of Labour Party.
Well, except in the Daily Telegraph here, the Energy Secretary, as you know, Claire Coutinho, said Labour's net zero plans risk blackouts and public unrest. That's what she... Well, so why is it ridiculous? Because the claim to make it electricity by renewables by 2030, she says, risks blackouts.
Well, first of all, on blackouts, the evidence is completely to the contrary. We've not seen the new nuclear being put in that needs to be put in under the Conservatives.
How long will that take?
To go in.
How long will new nuclear take?
That's why it will take some years, but that's why, just as the Climate Change Committee itself has recommended, you need to keep that reserve of gas there for these kind of extremist situations that you might get into. As I say, the Climate Change Committee itself has made that clear. That's consistent with that drive to net zero. But if we're not moving in this direction, we'll continue to see bills being kept artificially high. The public unrest is coming from people paying too much money for their energy under the Conservatives.
We do have, as Tim said, we have got a really strong track record of tackling climate change in the UK. We're the first of G20 countries to have halved emissions, more than halved our greenhouse gas emissions.
But it's going forward,
that is a great
is what we're talking about.
Going forwards, we need to do it in a pragmatic way, which ensures there aren't burdens on individual households. Absolutely, and where we maximise the economic advantage. So I'm the Minister for Decarbonisation of Transport. We're doing a lot on decarbonising aviation aviation, for example, sustainable aviation fuel. We're investing in industries here, creating jobs here, particularly in the north of England. There are huge opportunities here if you're ahead of the curve. But it's got to be managed in a pragmatic way, where you get to net zero, where you take the population with you, where you don't have burdens on individual households, and that's what we've been doing. My fear about some of the Labour stuff, totally decarbonising electricity production by 2030, is that it's simply undoable, except at extraordinarily high cost.
Is it
everyone in the industry?
Well, is it undoable? Well, hang on. Let Naomi respond.
I think what is really reckless are these so-called climate policies that link decarbonization with increased energy costs, and we have seen this in dramatic ways under the Tories. What we need to do is show that it is possible to address the climate crisis, which, by the way, is a huge drag on the economy. This idea that we're going to have growth in the context of climate breakdown, the latest research is showing that actually the models that our governments have been working with dramatically undercounted the economic drag of climate disasters. I mean, these hurricanes that you were referencing earlier, they're not metaphorical. They're hugely expensive. There's a study that just came out from the National Bureau on Economic Research in the U.S. That likened the effects of climate damage to an unending and permanent war on the economy. So you're rebuilding from these disasters. It's not benefiting people. It's hugely expensive, but you're not even getting back to where you were before the flood, the hurricane, the drought. You're paying farmers for failed crops. It's the most inefficient use of resources. So what we need to do is we need to have policies that are going to decarbonize, but are going to get polluters to pay.
Well, we haven't actually talked that much over the campaign. When I say we, I mean the politicians haven't talked about it that much, but we will come back to the issue of climate policies because it's Manifesto week this week. Manifestos, yes, I heard that little cheer there from you, Tim. I'm glad you're excited. We are too, of course. They set out the policies a political party would pledge to deliver if they were to win a general election. Throughout this week and next, we'll be looking at what the main parties are going to be offering voters in the campaign. Now, this morning, it was the Liberal Democrats who launched their manifesto. Let's have a listen to the party led by Ed Davey.
The truth is that unless we properly value care, unless we properly support carers, we will never be able to fix the crisis in our NHS or get our economy back on track. And that's why I'm so proud that the Liberal Democrats have put health and care at the heart of our campaign in this general election, and at the heart of our manifesto too.
Let's talk to Christine Jardine from the Liberal Democrats. Of course, we know from his own personal experience in terms of caring for his family, for his relatives, his mum and disabled son, that Ed Davey has invested an awful lot into this issue of health and social care. So what exactly is the party promising at this election?
Well, what we are promising is that we will provide free personal care for people to get them out of hospital. We will also provide more carers by increasing the minimum wage for carers to get more people into that sector. And that will allow us to get more people home, to support carers, and also to help the NHS to move people off the waiting list and into the hospitals. And I think Ed, speaking today, yes, he was speaking from his own experience, but he was speaking to the experience of so many people in this country who've been through what Ed was talking about, who are carers or who depend on social care, or who have a member of their family who is currently in a hospital ward when they could be at home, getting free personal care in their own home, being looked after by their families. That's so important to so many people in this country. And there was one other thing he said today which touched me because it spoke to my personal experience and so many people I've come across, is parents who lose their partner, restoring the support that there used to be through the widow's pension for parents. And I think that is absolutely vital for so many families who, in such a difficult economic situation.
All right.
And these are the things that are our priorities in fixing the health and care system.
So this is your key priority in this election. What are the costs? Because we're talking about a high price tag, aren't we? Billions here.
We are indeed, but we have also looked at how we can pay for that and how we can pay for it without increasing the burden on working families. And what we want to do is, first of all, reverse the tax cuts that this government gave to big banks. Now, that will raise £4 billion. But we also want to reform capital gains tax so that the wealthiest people in the country, and when I say that, I mean billionaires, big banks, that those are the people who are paying more in capital gains tax. Other people under our reforms would pay less, but we would bring in another £5 billion by reforming capital gains tax. And we would spend that £9 billion a year on improving health and social care in this country to help those many people who need that support. But also it helps get the country back to work. It gets people off waiting lists and into hospitals for the treatment that they need to get back out and do the jobs that they want to be doing.
Christine, in all likelihood, you're not going to form the next government, and Ed Davey is unlikely to be the next Prime Minister. So how will you get any of this on the agenda under a new government after this election?
Well, we don't know what Parliament's going to look like after the election. No. That's up to the voters. And if they hear what we're saying and they like it and they elect a Liberal Democrat MP, they will get, first of all, a local champion who will work first and foremost for their constituency, for their community.
Right.
But also, if we get more Liberal Democrat MPs, then we change the balance in Parliament. If we are the third party again, we have more influence. And up and down the country, people are recognising that we are, in very many seats, the people who can defeat the Conservatives, who can move them out of power.
So you're thinking that you've got the ear, right? So have
seats.
you got the ear? Have you got the ear of Keir Starmer and Annalise Dodds, who's here in the studio, in terms of if they win the next election, you'll be able to push this policy?
The people whose ears that we want at the moment, the people who we want to speak to, are the British public, because it's up to them who forms the next government. It's up to them what the balance of Parliament looks like, and that's what we are focusing on at the moment.
Right.
Our priorities for fixing the NHS and care and getting people back to work and fixing the economy. That's what's important.
Before I open it up to our other guests, I know it's a sore point and historic to some extent, but when you were part of the government with the Conservatives from 2010 to 2015, you dropped that key pledge of free tuition fees. And there is this issue of trust, isn't there, in terms of a policy like this one, laudable in terms of spending and investment on the health service and social care, but whether or not you'd have any chance of either keeping to it or pushing the next government to take it on?
Well, what we have done is we recognised that, you know, we fought every day in government just about with the Conservatives to hold them back from doing the things that we've seen them do since, and in promoting positive policies like the triple lock in pensions. We couldn't deliver on tuition fees, and that hurt us, and we have spent the past 9 years in opposition rebuilding that trust with the British people through what we have done as constituency MPs,
well, let me
through what we've done on local councils, through what we have done in other areas.
All right, well, let me bring in our other guests, but particularly first of all, Annalise Dodds. Would you take on a policy like that? That's transformative, isn't it? £9 billion to be spent every year on the NHS and social care. You're not promising anything like that.
Well, we believe that our policies on the NHS and social care would be transformative as well. Obviously, you're going to have different political parties setting out their stall with different proposals, but we set out in detail how we would be making sure we had those additional appointments, 40,000 extra every week, how we would also make sure, and an issue, and I'm really pleased to hear the Liberal Democrats talking about this now, how we would make sure that for the workforce in social care, we were getting a grip on those challenges, because that's been at the root of so many of the problems that people have experienced trying to get social care. We would have that fair pay agreement in social care, and so, you know, it's encouraging to see that other parties are starting to talk about the workforce in social care as well. Because
yes,
it's so
but the problem is illustrated, Anthony, by Boris Johnson's commitment to actually deal with social care. He had a plan for that, never happened.
It got delayed. We are publishing our manifesto tomorrow, so we need to wait for discussion on that in terms of social care. Social care is clearly it is a very important issue. I know precisely why it's so important, and the NHS generally, which obviously have massively increased spending on. Annalise talked earlier about the waiting list. I mean, the worst waiting lists in the UK are in Labour-run Wales.
But they're terrible.
Wales and in England.
People wait far longer for the NHS under Labour-controlled Wales than they do under Conservative control.
Well, it's true. The waiting lists are pretty terrible across the UK if you're waiting for an operation. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but Christine Jardine, thank you very much for joining us there from the Liberal Democrat Manifesto launch. You heard there from Anthony Brown. We are going to have the Conservatives' manifesto published tomorrow, and Labour's, I believe, on Thursday. Is that right, Annalise? Oh, we'll have to wait and see. Well, you can wait for that. You won't even come. Thank you to all of my guests for joining us today, and I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15. From all of us here, bye-bye.